This is the Liosion bus station, which you use for Delphi. And this is just a little park across the street from it. It's interesting they're watering it. It's kind of nice. And it probably is a nice little respite for the folks who live around here. It gives you another insight into how people live in these environments that are so compacted and devoid of any real interest outside of a building. Is that you not only have these awnings which protect you from the sun, but they also protect you from other views. And then you sometimes just roll down steel grated window coverings like the stores use. And that allows you to completely isolate yourself within the fortress of your home. Not that you're so much afraid for security, but just that it's the fortress of your home. This is where your world is. Larger solar installation I've seen. Lots of small ones, but no real big ones, except for this one. There's two more. Here's a typical small one, but beyond is the large one. For whatever the reason is, you're all nearby. First view of the American flag in several weeks. I am now at Delphi, where the oracle hung out. This was a doozy of a place for those folks to get to. And all kinds of people came here. Magnificent view, eh? Almost looks Cycladic, but I don't think so. For exercising my inherent Perian interests. These are shields. If not that one, certainly this one is. Non-shield, but notice that large protrusion. Maybe that's interesting. Just pieces from the south frieze of, I assume, one of the buildings that they didn't identify in that note. They said the fragments are too sparse for them to define what the subject matter was. Here's a fallen soldier. Whether the one on the left has made him fall or not, I think so, since the artist has put his foot right on the leg of the man fallen, indicator of the victor versus the fallen. Interesting here, a lion attacking a man.
In der Wirklichkeit Familien von ganz Griechenland waren in diesem politischen und religiösen Verband in der Amphiktyoni vertreten. Und es gab natürlich eine Heereseinheit wie all das.
The small Koteros in bronze, maybe just post-archaic, because you'll notice it doesn't have that archaic smile on the face. So the break in the elbow. And the very sculptured buttocks, legs. Nice, because we can see some of the original detail, and then the archaeologists and artists remake of the remainder that we didn't recover. Here you can see that the motifs are incised, but then painted. At least at the bottom, the top, they're not. They're just little vignettes. We'll see now are some of the valuable offerings that were left by people. Kind of like we tithe or we burn candles, that sort of thing. These look like the remains of human bodies, but may not be. The healthier the person, the more inclined they were to leave something valuable. kind of the same theory in which chapels and some of the major cathedrals were financed by the wealthy in order to buy their way into heaven. Remains of a bull, lost wax method, I would assume. Wow. These are votive weapons. In other words, these were left as offerings. And they came from all over Greece and outside of Greece also. But it may be a great repository of original evidence, if you will, for archaeologists. The remaining sculptures from the pediments, plus any additions necessary to make the whole thing stay together. Hopefully we can see a little drawing of this. I'm going to pan this just quickly so we can see what it generally looks like, at least what they think they can detect it look like in pieces. What the other sources of evidence were for other pieces that are in the diagram, who knows? Here we can pretty much make it out. It's a lion killing a bull. You can see his forepaw there right in the side of the bull, and that reflecting his hair, probably in his mane. Here, humans, horses, panning that same direction, trying to block the light out so you can see. Here's the remainder of what remains. And on this side, again, another lion. His teeth are gone. Fortunately for the missing piece of the bull, which is mostly gone, so that's probably a draw. Here again, you have the archaic smile, or smirk I would prefer to call it. And this is the winged foot. This is the Temple of Apollo. We'll see its site a little later. It's a nicely preserved section. Getting a closer look at that lion. It almost looks like it either lost its lower teeth or was used as a fountain. Pretty little saucer in perfect condition. They count much, but here what I think is nice is the portrayal of the human body. But notice that archaic smirk, again indicating that 5th century, or 6th century really, 500s. And without really knowing what's going on, it does seem tortured, doesn't it? Without any knowledge, the exact opposite, almost tranquil. Notice those little holes in the cape for holding something, probably a gold band or brass band of some sort. The Minotaur, half man, half horse. Can't see the horse. Those holes indicate other little goodies that were put up. Believe it or not, this represents a fully armed Amazon. To see these original pieces. It's hard to get a shot without the reflecting light.
Right there.
Colors, of course, would have been far more vibrant than they are now. Be realistic if it was meant to be purple. Bronze incense burner. I want to look at that face as closely as I can. Treasuries of the sanctuary of Athena, Plataea. In other words, this is what was built in order to leave offerings to kind of buy out, if you will, or thank the oracles. These are athletes, normally men, always men, excuse me, normally naked. Here's some more bronze characters or figurines. Ah, a serpent, that's interesting. Or snake, literally. Remember, the snake was a great positive symbol for Athena and for medicine. Aeschylus, or someplace like that, that was near Epidravos. Here, not that smirk, at the 4th century. Notice this capital. It's defined as Doric. I believe the simplest, most severe. As the archaeologist told me yesterday, those definitions or characterizations, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, carried over to the other aesthetics of the culture, including clothing and this general appearance. So a man might be construed as dressing rather Dorically, even today. Maybe that's where we get the concept of Doric. This is kind of neat because it kind of gives us an idea of how these panels and other architectural details fit together, as does this. And we need to find out what this is. Here another base. These would be offerings outside of temples, normally by important people or entire communities or even small divisions of the country. This is of a little girl in the 3rd century. Notice the very realistic, authentic smile. The entire face just wants you to react. I'm going to let us go on the internet and find out who Aemilius Paulus was. It's an irony, it just occurred to me that on the Camino de Santiago, pilgrims, quote unquote, leave stones, usually in huge collections, along with those of others, to indicate that they have symbolically dropped one of their sins, if not all of them. I never had that many stones available that I could carry, or had the strength to carry to get rid of all my sins, but it appears that Aemilius was really working hard on his here. There's a circular altar from the sanctuary of Athena, Pronea. You have a minotaur, some kind of serpent-type goody. Here men in confrontation, or the athletics of wrestling. Here battle for sure, with a shield and a fallen man, it looks like, in between. The Charioteer of Delphi, considered to be perhaps the finest of all the ancient Greek sculptures ever recovered. We'll walk around it slowly, and then we'll focus on it a little bit tighter. Notice the long pleated garment. Notice the reins in the right hand. Notice how the garment wraps high around his waist and then has, like suspenders, a crossing in the back. The purpose of that was to keep the garment from billowing out when it was ridden fast in the chariot race. I want to look closely at the face. A severe period, which historically was the time that Athens was battled with many of its adversaries continually, and its art reflects a complete lack of frivolity, or that little archaic smile, for example, is gone. Here is raw realism. Athenians were facing the world as it really was, coming right straight at them, and dangerously so. Not a time of calm reflection. Notice the facial expression is not one of braggadocio. This relaxed form indicates that it was after the race and he's making his victory lap, because there's none of the tension apparently inherent in this sculpture. He's also slightly rotated to his left hip, coming out towards us now. He'll have been a household slave, because normally the aristocracy member of a family, a young one, would be the charioteer, and they would run naked. They would be naked in athletic events, so it would not be prudent or proper to have a household slave naked. Those commenting with knowledge on the sculpture comment on the glass eyes, one of the few that have been found that are original, how they stare intently out at you. Of course, after the fact, we come up with all the feelings, etc., that we have, but the original artist intended is not known. Now, this was from a wealthy person in Sicily, but is actually thought to have been created by an Athenian sculptor in Athens. Her tableau was considered to be a man on his chariot with either 4 or even 6 horses. These are the only other pieces that remain of what was considered to have probably been one of the most dramatic bronze sculptured tableaus of that ancient period. Interesting, obviously relatively modern, I mean, compared to the ancient world, some kind of a mechanical flute, I believe, or organ, however you want to call it. A model of the area that we're going to be visiting. We'll be entering into the right here, and then it wraps up along this great way, or the holy way, or whatever they called it. This is where all of the various treasuries were. There is, I'm not sure what the name of that temple is, no doubt to Athena. And then that little stadium area we'll be visiting, the dark area in particular, is where we're going to first, which is the sacred precinct. Actually better seen probably on my own map. This stairway to begin. Using Rick's guidebook as my walking guide, he suggests we pan the slope so you can see as we walk up the holy way, or whatever it's called, the monuments that are visible, and it winds back and forth. You can see people way up there, so it goes left, right, left. What we're about to enter into is the Roman Agora. A picture of how it might have looked. And we're standing inside the Stoa. As you can see from these columns, which would have been replicated by ones along that side and then along this long side here. Standing and defined by the columns along that left side, and then probably right along in front of me and completing that rectangle on those dimensions. And start up the sacred way. And Vic points out these square areas that you see here would have been the pedestals for large dramatic statues, perhaps like the one we saw the remains of in the museum a few moments ago. But looking at the size of these stones, you get an idea of how important this was. Some color to this. Imagine that you have trekked from whatever country or part of Greece you've trekked from, and you've just been bathed by the priests, or with the priests, in the Castalian spring in a ravine, which would have been before we came up the walkway and into this archaeological center. So I'll have to go back and try and find that. We paraded ceremoniously to the temple, up today's same sacred way. Now, whether that would have been this Roman temple or not, I don't know. Certainly it couldn't have been during the Archaic period, since Romans weren't there yet. Like a herd of undisciplined tourists, it would have been a very sedate ceremonial parade up this route of people going to seek the oracle's opinion. Now, this is serious stuff in those days, very serious. The apparently enclosure of the king of Argos, I believe, being that area over near Nafplio where I was. But instead of a very lovely curved edifice that this would have been even more grand, with statues, etc. Here. Right across the way, this enclosure also would have been circular, but with spectacular views. Probably paid for these positions. See nothing that differentiates anything here in Rick's notes for us, so we'll just keep wandering up through here. Into those large enclosures here are relatively modest ones, but of differing sizes, perhaps reflecting differences in importance or resources. This is the treasury of the Sikyonians. Again, probably a part of Greece, maybe even one of the islands. So here would have been offerings brought over time by residents from there, if not the community itself. A little circular, small space. But imagine these statues, all brightly colored, the stone fresh and bright. Treasury, but I can't read what it was. The architecture here would have been quite outstanding. Look at that work there. Here's what it looked like. There's the rear room, the cella, and then the pronos. And notice it says it had 2 columns in front of the pronoa, and in front of that is a pistodome. What the columns and the portion above the columns would have looked like. Those are the treasury of the Sikyonians and the Siphnions. Changed memory cards, so I'm going to duplicate a little bit of what we did just for reference. There are the Sikyonians. And notice some of the curved stone indicating some of the other elements that would have been inside this monument, or this treasury house. Another one, I can't read the name of that unless Siphnian, S-I-P-H-N-I-A-N treasury. I'll imagine that as these were built into the hillside, leaving spaces, others came after and filled in the spaces with their more moderate buildings. This is what they might have looked like. Where we are in all of this is the lower right-hand corner where it says 1 and 2. This is the treasury of the Boeotians, or however we pronounce that. And notice that those treasuries continued on down this road, although we're going to be hooking right here. But they covered this entire slope, apparently. Not to mention whatever this one was, which we'll find out in a moment, I hope. This curious device represented the center of the earth, the center of the world. Presumably somewhere around here the column of the dancers would have been exhibited. Treasury of the Athenians, no surprise that that would be this building. Majestic, powerful in its imagery, and probably had to be big enough to hold a lot of valuable stuff. Here's what it might have looked like in the day. Again, to orient, here it is. Here we're on the inside of whatever this one was. Notice the interest in these circular ones, which I actually do think are more interesting and probably more expensive to create. Interesting to see the lapidarium littering the hillsides of stones left over. Here's another circular one seen from the inside. Now either that rock protrusion there or that stone up there was considered, it was called the Rock of Sybil, who was a 10-foot legendary pre-oracle. She delivered her oracles from either one of those 2 sites, whatever they were. Would have been the Rock of Sybil. Makes sense, since in the old days nothing else was here but Sybil. And that up there was where the Sphinx of Naxios status was. On a 35-foot tall statue. Apparently that 35-foot tall statue, or column, or whatever it was, used the very best marble, which apparently guaranteed access to the Sybil's advice, even during her most busy times. See, it pays. Here's the Athenian Stoa, and notice that there's Greek written along that top course of stone. In spite of the fact that that's a retaining wall, this was the Stoa of the Athenians, right up the hill from the Treasury of the Athenians, and that is the Temple of Apollo that we'll be going to shortly. And this was the Do Not Touch Please Treasury memorial, apparently. The purpose of this Stoa by the Athenians was to store the booty from the Persian victory at the Battle of Salamis, 480. I believe that's the battle, may have been the battle at sea, shortly after the Persians completely razed Athens. Notice how far down it was, how large it was, and how well installed those stones are. It does look a lot more like the Incas than anything we've seen so far. Now, how this functioned as a stoa, as well as obviously with those pedestals, a site for many important statues. This was just a polygonal wall that was designed to support that terrace that holds the Apollo temple. I really like the Inca walls. It was so well designed, and it's without mortar that it was able inherently to withstand the various earthquakes. One of these gray block pedestals once supported a 26-foot bronze column with 3 intertwined snakes, and it was the tripod of Plataea. I don't see what this is. Look at the detail. I wonder why that looks so new and the Capitol looks so old. Dramatic setting, though, isn't it? Presumably more treasuries down there. Ranging all up this hillside, and we can see structures were all over on that hillside. Imagine when this place was covered. Notice how nicely this stonework is done. You'll see that movement has played its role here. We're up now on the little plateau that polygonal wall was meant to be the retaining wall for. We can look at the structure underneath, part of Apollo's temple, or the temple to Apollo. The altar of Apollo. Yet see what this was for, unless it is the tripod of Plataea. Now we're entering where the ramp is of the Temple of Apollo. Hopefully I can find a way in the future to, or at least technologists can figure out a way to reduce that guide talk down to nothing so that something can be voiced over. Must have been impressive, eh? Look at the size of those columns. Now there were 4 in that direction, or 3 in that direction, so 3 here, of course. And we can get an idea, I think, by looking down here, and we'll walk down here and look at the size of this temple. But before we do, imagine your anxiety level after all that you'd been through, all that you hope to accomplish. You're now walking up that very ramp, through those very columns, to stand in front of the oracle. I mean, I'm not sure Dorothy could even begin to appreciate this, but maybe she's the only one who can. Across from the temple was this area, which was used for making sacrifices before you entered the Temple of Apollo. Apparently to the right of this area would have been 50 impressive columned statues. Can't be sure of my interpretation of Rick's information whether right along here is where those 50 statues would be to the right of the Temple of Apollo. Presumably the position of these stones reflects that there were steps up into the temple, which makes sense in addition to that ramp. Notice the knobs that were designed to hold stones in place, and you could understand the similar sized holes in those Inca rocks if in fact there was some rocks contiguous to the outside of those walls that those knobs could fit into, but there isn't. Those are the outside of the Inca walls. Never solved that enigma. Here a remnant of the inner wall of the temple enclosing the cella, C-E-L-L-A. Possible on each of these pedestals once stood dramatic statues. Just guessing, but I'm guessing that columns came all the way down this side. Here were the offerings of Koteros. Some highly weathered drums from those columns that still are extant. And probably at some point in time they ran some structure up here that caused those lines to be in place. Look at the spectacular and dramatic context of this site and that temple. Very Inca-like. And from here, as we sidetrack to look at the temple from a different perspective, we can see down into the Athenian treasury. The polygonal wall over there. Intrigued by these curious little details like that diagonal line running there, and then the one more or less horizontal but slightly diagonal that's larger there. If you look carefully at these stones that I'm passing, you can see that they actually formed frames. Those two pseudo columns, here being the frame picture portion, perhaps for paintings or for some kind of inscription. This may be a stone that was broken off somehow. It's always interesting, particularly in this stone. Look at how it's been carved out here, carved out further and there. Probably to hold the statue base in that spot. Who knows? Look how weathered they are. Apparently ahead of us was the altar of Chiot's area. Ta-da! This building ahead of us here is apparently this one right here. And this, notice the bull here ready for sacrifice. And maybe a man there is either carrying implements for that ritual sacrifice. Notice how we glorify the killing of something and make it sound like it's noble. Or maybe he's taking up his own less pretentious sacrifice. What would have stood on to the right is what would have stood on a pedestal. That gives us an idea. That would be impressive. And that other column nearby, still another column somewhere, and I thought was for sacrifices. Look at the huge pedestals there and the column stubs that remain. There might have been 6 of those right across that one area. Thinking that that's what that might be for, was the pedestal for the tripod of the Plataeans. And if so, it represented to all Greeks a votive offering for the defeat of the Persians. Fortunately, the Phoenicians melted down the gold when they won in the Third Sacred War, 354 to 343 BC. And then Constantine the Great transferred the Serpentine column to Constantinople when it was founded in 330 AD. behind us here would have been the Stoa of King Attalos. We can see that back wall there, retaining but nothing but undifferentiated stones lying about. Nothing that would give us an indication of where the columns, etc. were. The archaeologists have stacked all of it here, so someday maybe they can, with a computer, recreate it, reposition these stones correctly. Here we're looking at some of the buildings that adjoin off to the side this area of monumental stone. And notice that one has a circular, like a kiva almost, over on its side, as does that one there. That rounded end oftentimes indicated a placement of an altar. So who knows what those were? Were they just less expensive treasury houses? So now we're working our way up below 28, up near 30 to the theater. Here another retaining wall, but notice it's been buttressed by more recent stone. But all of this covered with monuments of some sort. Perhaps we can imagine that those indented portion inside that square beneath us was designed for containing the blood from the sacrifices, and it would have had to have been fairly decent size for a bull, but this place must have smelled like hell. Not to mention, what do you do to get rid of bull after bull after bull? So we're up in the theater district now. This is where we would have found that statue we saw in the museum. Imagine if we were standing up here, how those statues sitting on those pedestals would seem impressive, because we could see them even more closely, and how big the Apollo temple would be, since we're still not above its height. Notice on the far hillside those lines that go diagonally. Mining operation or something. Continued to climb up towards the theater, presumably. Greek theater. One wonders what went on here, though. This is interesting. I'd seen a couple of them. What they are is water sprinklers, as any farmer rancher would know. And I'm guessing their purpose is not perhaps just to make this area green, but maybe also somehow it preserves the structures. We're going to continue on up to the stadium. The theater is probably about right where the tip of my fingernail is. We're going to wander up, I'm guessing, this windy road or trail to get to the stadium. So we're getting outside of the sacred area, which is all of this area in here. So we'll stop for a moment in our steep climb up to the stadium to take a closer look at the theater. Notice it looks like it has 2 levels at least. And a little bit more than an oval stage. Probably where those students are standing, all of that would have been the backdrop. Unless they left it low so that you could appreciate the temple behind the theater. So notice that we can see the rear wall of the theater, so that pretty much defines it. All of that, of course, would have been finished off beautifully. And continuing our pan about, there the Athenian Treasury. I wonder, as I see the water pouring out of that hillside into this votive treasury area, perhaps, what role did running water play in all of this? Was it used aesthetically or for some other more pragmatic purpose?
T'as vu le mec là, le mollet, le mec avec le tabac sur le mollet là? Ouais. Il s'est dit c'est le mec là, c'est sur... il s'est fait tatouer? Non, c'est qui? C'est un acteur gay.
Peut-être qu'il l'a toqué parce qu'il aime bien ce acteur.
Acteur X-gay. Je te promets.
Bien informé, hein. Ça te documente pas mal.
Genre, il voulait lui mettre un coup de poing.
Ouais, j'ai mis un uppercut la veille, laisse tomber, je l'ai fumé.
Et Sagat, tu vois, c'est Sagat. Sagat, c'est le grand coteau de la bataille.
Ouais, peut-être.
Même il a une grande...
Although down there you can see what might be those long indentations which would function as toe starting blocks, if you will. But not all the stones, so who knows? I wonder what those entry points were. Maybe, oh, they're not, I see. They're just jogs in the wall. I can see just a hint of those two levels in the seats, particularly with the grasses indicating water's collected and things could grow easily. So in the original days, people just sat on the grass slopes, but then Hadrian in this 2nd century spent some Roman bucks and put the seats in. So down there was the starting gates. Those look like gates. Interesting. So here were the finishing blocks. God forbid you stubbed your toe with them. Apparently up there were the ancient fortifications of Philomelos. Obviously not visible to us through the trees. It's interesting to wonder if these indicate that this area might have been a covered walkway. So these apparently are not gates, but rather archways that they spoke about. And those were rather unique, apparently, for some reason. I think those shiny comb-like things up there are designed to stop rock falls from hitting the theater. I just thought this was a pretty bush or tree. So I've reminded myself that there's an aqueduct here. Although notice that metal door there and then this manhole cover here, so you wonder how much of this is natural versus created in the past. But it does foretell the aqueduct. The lady, I think, that manages the men who work here on the gardening indicated to me that there is a natural spring, and it was used not only in the aqueduct, but the purpose of that water, part of it in the ancient days, was to keep things green. So like any ordinary cemetery, as well as the site here, indicated by the sprinklers we saw, the desire to keep everything green was ever present. Notice how this rock has been hollowed out in order to hold some kind of statuary or obelisk of some sort. Somewhere down here in front of the theater runs the aqueduct, so let's go down and find it. That could be part of it right there. See that through the trees? And maybe right in there. So this may be part of the aqueduct, or simply may be water that the town uses. I think it's the latter for the safety of tourists. So pretty obviously I found the aqueduct, at least this part of it. I didn't see any portion up above, and this is flowing in the opposite direction I thought it would go. So it must come across here, come across like this somehow, and then up there a ways, do a left turn and hook up there a ways, do a left turn and hook back down. And what's kind of clever, but no reason why it shouldn't be, are the fact that these upper stones overlap the lower stone, which just makes sense, particularly going down a grade. Not only holds the aqueduct together in all planes, but makes for a smooth transition, perhaps perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps it creates little falls which break up the speed of the water a bit, which would be good too. That it ran from that corner of the theater there. It had to run just about through me. Over there somehow, or maybe up here a little bit. Now they have to climb grade, can't do that. Over here somehow make that turn. So here a closer view of how these overlap. See, that overlaps there and creates a little drop off. Come down here, hit something, drop down, then goes down through there and goes through the channel underneath those stones. So a lot of it may be up above us, if it's still there, is under stones. Interesting how we modern people, maybe just me, look at something like this and go, oh, how clever they were. What did we think they did? Do we think this is the first time this idea has ever been used? Was by the Greeks? Hell no. Probably used 1,000, 2,000 years ago with ditches. 10,000 years ago when agriculture started with ditches. You see by these curved stones that it takes a turn probably that way and goes on down the hill further. So it looks like it has that triangular archway that you see in the Lion Gate, for example, of the Mycenae. Maybe they copied that. You just know that there were Athenians who stood exactly where I am standing, just so they could frame for themselves, without their camera or iPod, the statue in the sky, right on that skyline of the rock cliff behind it. The drawing of a bull. And you wish that they would put plaques here that would tell us what that pedestal says in Greek. You can see just a little bit of the letters in it. Here are people trying to meticulously restore the semblance of the Roman Agora, one component of it. Up there is the falls, which perhaps is no longer running, or not running right now without more water. It doesn't make any difference, it's all blocked off to us anyway in that ravine. And then somewhere around here would have been the spring, and it's here that you would have come and ritually bathed yourself before you then began the trek up through the sacred way. Something that's happening at sites like this particularly, as they get inundated by tour buses more and more, is the restriction of available access to the places. You saw it as we were walking up there, so many little corridors roped off. They would argue that's for safety, and probably to some degree it is, but it's also because that means there's less they have to manage, less they have to maintain. This is the rock fountain, probably off away from our view up there. Down here somewhere, the sanctuary of Athena Pronea, as well as the old gymnasium. That must have been beautiful in that circular format. Here's what the entire complex would have looked like. And just to orientate, this is where we started up here in the little town of Delphi. Came down, wandered all the way up in here to the stadium up there, and back down and along here, and this is where we're at. Now we'll go down into there. To those two buildings. And then the bigger one here. us a sense of the dimensions, at least so far as width and length go. Apparently all the stones required to do the rebuilding are here. Again, notice that domino design for attaching one block to another. You can see it on several of these, although I don't see the matching holes for it. What a beautiful edifice this must have been. I'm trying to frame this so we can have the illusion that it's complete. Of course, that doesn't last long. Oh, now, this is interesting. My domino detail that I thought was for attaching appears to be just for looks. These columns in the simplest of style, no base. And a very, very simple capital. Just begin to imagine how it might have looked. A little bit more interesting column base. There are couple of them in place. So we can get a little bit of a hint there, the raised altar portion perhaps. Maybe defining for us the dimensions of the building, those outer columns. But notice that they had walls filling in. That's rare. I wonder if that was a later innovation. The cella, of course, had its own regular wall right there, but you can see how columns would have continued down here somewhere. There's been a lot of movement of this stone for some reason. Notice here just a small groove for draining water away from this temple. I'm guessing that there was no need or any way to bow these courses of stone as they did in the Parthenon or Pantheon, whichever one it is. Getting those two words mixed up for the last 50 years, no reason I should sort it out now. So here the sign indicates the gymnasium is this way, but this is the way we just came to get to this temple, and I got a feeling that it's closed, one more area that's closed off. So it was way up there, to the left of that pretty lilac bush, up where those trees are, that we were at the stadium. And we'll walk back up where you see that truck laboring and around the corner to the little town of Delphi. This is probably as close as we get to the gymnasium. There's not much to see anyway. So, we're done. You're really looking for a romantic, dramatic place to either eat lunch or find a hotel room. This would be one place. And this is the little town of Delphi. There's another street up there. My guess is there's lots of hotels here. Probably something similar to our kestrel. This is the first little town we come to after we leave Delphi. Dramatic sight, isn't it?
No.